throwing it back into circulation, and that's what the lymphatic system does. The lymphatic system also is responsible for first, when we talk about digestion, when we get there, the lymphatic system first absorbs your fats. So it's the first line of absorbing fats. It starts to manufacture the fat into a different substance that we will call chyle in the digestive system, and then it brings it back into the digestive system. But first, fats enter the lymphatic system. And I mean, the lymphatic system and immunity are kind of tied together because there are a lot of cells that roam around in the lymphatic system that pertain to immunity. But because of that, also bacteria and pathogens and viruses can also enter this system very easily. So we have to be careful. Okay, so when fluid leaks out of your bloodstream, okay, into the tissues, and it's picked up into the lymphatic system, that fluid changes its name to lymph, okay? So lymph is fluid that flows through lymphatic vessels, okay? And lymphatic vessels are only found in the lymphatic system. So we're going to take each one of these terms and talk about it a little bit more. So lymphoid tissue is going to be immune tissue that is basically collections of cells that form a common function, which we know what is the definition of a tissue. So we're going to be talking about lymphocytes, which we've mentioned before, monocytes, and monocytes are large white blood cells that when they leave circulation, they become macrophages, so they become like the garbage trucks that help absorb and clean up any debris that may be in the area. And then you got multiple tissues coming together to form lymphatic organs. And those lymphatic organs are designed to contain diseases, contain pathogens, and destroy them. So again, contributing to immunity, okay? So when we talk about the immune system, we're really kind of including tissues and organs in certain parts of the body. So for example, the spleen, or your lymph nodes, or the thymus, which we'll talk about, is an organ that's located on the superior aspect of your heart. When we dissect the cats and look at blood vessels, you're going to have to remove the thymus gland from the cat because it's interlaced in between the great vessels on top of the heart and it gets in your way. So there's the thymus gland, tonsils we just talked about, okay, aggregates of lymphoid tissue, that's pretty much what tonsils are. The appendix, okay, and then Peyer's patches we'll talk a little bit more about as well. Those are found in your small intestine. Okay, so you've got, again, lymphoid tissue or immune tissue in different areas of the body that's designed to protect you against potential pathogens that may come in. Okay, so again, when fluid is leaked out of the bloodstream, filtered through the capillary walls, okay, it's going to contain plasma. Okay, that fluid, that ground substance, that extracellular fluid, it's going to have certain ions, it's going to have some sugars, proteins, and whatnot. But overall, the fluid is lower in protein compared to blood. So blood running through your bloodstream is a different composition than the fluid that's leaked out of your bloodstream. Okay, because we're not leaking out blood cells, right? You need blood cells. White blood cells will exit when they need to do their job. Red blood cells stay in circulation because they're just the oxygen transporters. So tissue fluid is going to have a lower protein content than your blood that's flowing through your blood vessels. So lymph is a little different as well. I mean, it's a different makeup than blood, but it can also contain bad things. So it can contain bacteria and viruses and pathogens, including macrophages, garbage trucks that are hanging around. But lymph can also contain bad things, okay? So, this picture is really nice because what's colored in green depicts the lymphatic system, okay? So we know now that arteries take blood away from the heart, exchange happens at the smallest blood vessels called capillaries, and then blood is redirected into the venous system, which basically takes that blood back to the heart. So what lymphatic vessels do is they take up that leaked fluid that's also coming out of the bloodstream, okay? And they take that fluid on a pathway and ultimately deliver it back into the venous system, back to the heart. So once lymph fluid enters a vein, okay, it becomes plasma again. So it becomes blood plasma again. So in the lymphatic system, fluid flows only in one direction, towards the heart. So it's a one-way road. One-way road. These vessels have all the same tunics, tunica media, tunica interna, tunica externa, okay? They don't have a pump, so they're similar to veins in that they have to use valves, okay, to prevent backflow and to continue a one-way route back to the venous system, okay? Okay, so the smallest blood vessel, or the smallest lymphatic vessels, okay, are called lymphatic capillaries. They're located interlaced amongst blood capillaries because these are the first vessel that's going to pick up the fluid that we'll now call lymph, okay? There are certain parts of the body that do not have a lymphatic system, so like your eye, bone, cartilage, your nervous system. They use different avenues to drain fluid, okay? And we'll learn about those later, okay? Lacteals are special structures in the lymphatic system that basically absorb fat from your diet. So we'll identify these in lab when we get to the digestive system, but lacteals are basically big lymphatic capillaries that absorb fat, okay? And once they start working on the fat, they turn it into a more reasonable substance for the body to recognize, and that's called chyle. Okay. Okay, so we'll talk about the lymphatic capillaries, their architecture in just a minute. But interesting note to remember is that lymphatic capillaries, they interlace themselves within a capillary bed, but they're closed at one end, okay? So they're closed at one end to make sure that there's a one-way flow of fluid back to the venous system. Okay, so if we go back to this picture, okay, venous capillaries are going to interlace themselves, okay, but they're closed at one end, so that forces flow in one direction, okay, which is back towards the heart through the venous system. Okay, so lymphatic capillaries have high permeability, which means that they will easily pick up that fluid that you're leaking out of your capillaries, okay? But they can easily also pick up other bad things like viruses and pathogens and bacteria. So in this picture, you see lymphatic capillaries, they're closed at one end, but they're interlacing themselves within a capillary bed. So as you're leaking fluid, the lymphatic capillaries are gonna catch it. And what happens is, here's one of the ends that are closed. As fluid gets filtered out of your capillary bed and it enters the interstitial area, interstitial space, okay, the interstitial space, the pressure is going to go up because fluid is constantly being leaked out. So that pressure is going to cause these mini valves on the ends of these capillaries to automatically open. So the pressure of the fluid pushing against a lymphatic capillary is going to open the valves and fluid is going to go straight in. Okay, so it's kind of a nice design. Okay, so from lymphatic capillaries then, lymph fluid flows through larger structures called collecting vessels. And collecting vessels are always found near blood vessels. Again, there's the same three tunics, media, externa, interna. They have valves, okay, because they don't use a pump. So if lymph is using valves and they don't have a pump, how is lymph going from, for example, your feet to the great veins of your heart? Well, it's using similar tactics that veins use. You're using skeletal muscle pump, right? You're using pulsating of nearby arteries. That's why you find lymphatic vessels. near arteries and veins, okay? Tunica media of lymph vessels has a little bit of smooth muscle in it, but it's not very significant. Okay, so they're really gonna be using arteries and skeletal muscles to help facilitate the pumping action, as well as valves to prevent backflow, all right? It's a one-way road. Okay, so from lymphatic vessels then, lymphatic vessels converge into large, what are called trunks, okay? And we have 6 major trunks based on what they're draining in the body, okay? So the first trunk is called the subclavian trunk, and that's going to drain lymph fluid from your upper limbs. So that's responsible for your upper limbs. Jugular trunks are responsible for your head and neck. That's where your jugular veins are in the neck, so they call it jugular trunks. Lumbar trunks are going to help drain from the lumbar region and your lower legs. Okay, intestinal trunk is going to drain from digestive organs and also drain fat, which is now called chyle. Bronchomediastinal, so that's in the thoracic area, that's going to drain fluid from the thoracic area. And then intercostal trunks, which is going to drain fluid from in between the ribs. Okay, so we got 6 main trunks that are draining fluid from different regions of the body. Okay, so those trunks ultimately dump into essentially 3 large structures, but mainly 2. So there's an enlargement. Again, all of these structures you're going to identify in lab when we get to it. The cisterna chyli. So the cisterna chyli is a structure where the lumbar and intestinal trunks come together. So lumbar and intestinal trunks come together and dump the fluid into this enlargement called the cisterna chyli. And the cisterna chyli is then going to join up with what's called the thoracic duct. Okay? And the thoracic duct is going to ultimately empty up top here at the junction in between your internal jugular and your subclavian vein, okay, which merges into your brachiocephalic vein. This right here is the big superior vena cava. Okay, so we haven't learned all the blood vessels yet. We'll get there, but I have them listed for you just so that you know which is which. This is superior vena cava, which is ultimately going to go into the right atrium. So the thoracic duct empties right at the junction between your neck and your arm, essentially, and then dumps it into the superior vena cava, okay? The right lymphatic duct, okay, is on the right-hand side. It's not connected to the thoracic duct, but it's alongside it, and then it ultimately comes up and drains on the right side in between the internal jugular and the right subclavian, ultimately destined for the superior vena cava, back to the right atrium of the heart, okay? So, previous picture, all right, everything that's in cream on this model is drained by the thoracic duct. So the thoracic duct drains 3/4 of the body, okay? What's shaded in green is the responsibility of the right lymphatic duct. Okay, so the right lymphatic duct is only responsible for the right side of the head, the neck, arm, and right side of the thorax. So a lot less real estate, it's a lot smaller of a vessel. Thoracic duct is quite large and it penetrates all the way through the thorax. Okay. Okay. Again, we'll identify those in lab. Okay, so now, we also need to talk about lymphoid tissue and then also lymphoid organs, okay? So lymphoid tissue, again, is going to be a collection of multiple cells that come together to do a common function. And in lymphoid tissue, a majority of those cells are lymphocytes. Okay, so we talked about lymphocytes in the respiratory system that are located in the lamina propria, that are waiting to mount an attack. So lymphocytes hang out in lymph tissue, and when they become activated, it's called infected. Infected means active. So if lymphocytes have been activated to do a job, to protect you against something, that's called infected connective tissue or active connective tissue. Okay? Reticular connective tissue, we've looked at this in lab, found in the spleen. Reticular connective tissue is composed of lymphoid tissue. All right. Now, lymphoid tissue is also found, okay, in the mucous membranes of organ systems that are open to the outside of the body to protect you, okay? So your digestive system, you're gonna find lymphoid tissue. Your urinary system, you're gonna find lymphoid. Respiratory, reproductive tracts, all open to the outside, all gonna have some sort of lymphoid tissue somewhere. So in the respiratory system, we know tonsils. Tonsils are aggregates of lymph tissue that are hanging out, lymphocytes just waiting to perform a job, okay? Peyer's patches. Peyer's patches are found in the ileum, I-L-E-U-M, which is the small intestine. Okay, so you find those in the small intestine, which is where a majority of absorption happens in the body, okay? So you want to have some sort of protection there, and you do. You have Peyer's patches that are hanging out, waiting to perform a job should something unusual or foreign be that wants to be absorbed into the body. These Peyer's patches can mount a response to that. Mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, so lymphoid tissue that are found in mucous membranes of organ systems that are open to the outside of the body, has a special name, and it's just called MALT, M-A-L-T. Okay? So, tonsils are an example of MALT in the respiratory system. Okay? Your appendix is purely lymphoid tissue. An immune responder, however, if it gets pissed off, you have to have it taken out, right? But you don't necessarily need it because you have many other areas that are going to protect you with this lymphoid tissue. Okay, so we've got lymphoid tissue out and about. This is basically just leading into the next structure in the hierarchy, which is lymphoid organs. So first we're talking about mucous membranes. So mucous membranes that are going to have MALT. Okay, so this is an example of Peyer's patches, for example, in the small intestine. So that's an example of MALT that's living in the digestive system. Okay, so that's aggregates of lymphoid tissue that will prepare an immune response for you. Then when you get multiple tissues coming together for a common function, you form specific lymphoid organs, and this is a lymph node as an example. Okay, so we'll talk about some different lymphoid organs and what they do for you. Okay, so we have what are called primary lymphoid organs and secondary lymphoid organs. Primary lymphoid organs are called primary because they make lymphocytes. Okay. Examples of primary lymphoid organs in the body, one is the thymus gland. Okay. Second example is in your bone marrow. So secondary lymphoid organs have aggregates of lymphoid tissue, but they don't make lymphocytes. Examples of secondary would be your spleen, your appendix, your tonsils, and your lymph nodes. Doesn't mean they don't utilize lymphocytes. Lymphocytes may travel to those organs, but those organs do not make them. Okay, so primary lymphoid organs, we have two options, either bone marrow or thymus, okay? So in this example, we're looking at bone marrow, okay? So in the bone marrow is where we make our blood cells, right? So we already discussed that blood cells are made in red bone marrow, okay? So this example at the very top is giving you stem cells, for example, that are growing in your red bone marrow, and they have not been dinged by your body to become a specific blood cell yet. So they're hanging out, but they're waiting to be told who to become. You're gonna become a red blood cell, you're gonna become a white blood cell, you're gonna become a monocyte, you're gonna become a lymphocyte. Like, oh, okay. If they're chosen to become a lymphocyte, okay, we have two different kinds of lymphocytes that we produce in the body. One are called B lymphocytes, the other are called T lymphocytes, and I have future slides that have this written down. So, once those stem cells get told what to do, if those cells are told you are going to become a B lymphocyte, those lymphocytes stay in the bone marrow. Okay, they stay in the bone marrow and they mature. If those cells are told you're going to become a T lymphocyte, T, those guys go to the thymus. B, those guys stay in the bone marrow. Okay, so T lymphocytes go to the thymus, and that's where they mature. Okay, get their education, figure out how to mount an immune response. Okay, so once those cells mature, and they become mature B cells and mature T cells, they can leave the bone marrow or they can leave the thymus. This is basically what it's showing. You're gonna leave at the level of a capillary where you leak, okay, out, but they can travel to other lymphoid organs. So B cells can go from the bone marrow, for example, to lymph nodes, and they can hang out. And they can just hang out and swim around and wait for some sort of pathogen to come. And if nothing happens, they can pop out of your lymph nodes and maybe go to the spleen. Or maybe they want to go to MALT. Maybe they want to go to the lamina propria in your respiratory system and hang out there for a while. So B cells and T cells can kind of do what they want and kind of migrate and wander around, which is a good thing because then you've always got these little protectors kind of roaming around in the body without you thinking about it. Okay, so when a B cell or a T cell becomes mature, okay, so when they learn, essentially a good analogy is they learn how to box, okay? So you've done your training, you've done all your boxing training, but you haven't had a match yet, okay? So this is where these lymphocytes are at. So they've received their education. What we call them is immunocompetent. So they've received an education, but they haven't used it yet. They haven't had a boxing match. So they know what their job is to do. They just haven't had that challenge yet. Okay, so we call that immunocompetence. So T cells or T lymphocytes get their immunocompetence in the thymus. B cells get their immunocompetence where? In the bone marrow, right? Okay. All right, we'll come back to those cells in a minute. So, other lymphoid organs include lymph nodes, okay? So lymph nodes are basically filters. They're little filtering organs that are designed to filter your lymph, okay? So there are B and T lymphocytes that are activated in lymph nodes as needed, and they attack foreign particles called antigens. Okay, we have a bunch of them. They're typically organized in clusters. So you've got axillary lymph nodes, you have cervical lymph nodes, you've got inguinal lymph nodes. We'll identify those later in lab. And they're not glands. People think that lymph nodes secrete things. They don't secrete things, they just filter. They filter lymph fluid. So in this picture, okay, here's a lymph node cut. We're going to look at lymph node histology under the microscope. But you've got vessels, okay, lymph collecting vessels that are leading into the lymph node. Those vessels are called afferent. You're going to hear the term afferent and efferent again, especially when we talk about the nervous system. Afferent always means coming towards or heading into, okay? Efferent, think of exit, going away from, okay? So in this lymph node, we have 4 afferent and 1, 2 efferent that are leading fluid out, okay? So if you have 4 doors going in and 2 doors going out, what does that do to flow of lymph? Does that slow it down or speed it up? It slows it down, right? With structure comes function, so that's gonna allow for filtration to occur, for lymph nodes to percolate the lymph, and for B and T cells to potentially mount a response should they need to, okay? And here again is that term hilus. That's an indentation in the lung. We'll learn there's a hilum in the kidney, there's a hilus or hilum in the lymph node, where vessels enter and exit the organ. Okay, so the efferent vessels exit out of the hilus of the organ. The tissue itself kind of involutes itself, which is called trabeculae. Capsule, which is kind of like the outer covering. Okay, and these trabeculae kind of create these different houses where filtration occurs in these lymphatic nodules, which again, we'll look at those under the microscope in lab. Okay, so lymph nodes, little filtering organs, located in clusters in various regions of the body. Okay, another lymphoid organ that we'll look at under the microscope is spleen. So the spleen, being the largest lymph organ, has basically 2 main functions, okay? The first function of the spleen is it's the red blood cell graveyard. So it's where red blood cells go to die and get resorbed, okay? What it also does, though, is it also helps to get rid of blood-borne antigens or foreign particles that are trying to enter the circulatory system. Oddly enough, when you're a fetus, so before you're born, you form blood cells in the spleen. But once you're born, the spleen becomes the red blood cell graveyard, which is interesting. So the spleen itself, when we look at it under the microscope, there's 2 what are called pulps that are associated with it. So the whole slide looks pink, okay? The whole slide looks pink. And then you're gonna see these aggregates of purple, okay, throughout the slide. And we call those aggregates of purple white pulp. Why do we call it white? I don't know, okay? But we call it white pulp, okay? And it's the white pulp that contains the lymphatic responsibilities of the spleen, okay? So that's where you're gonna find lymphocytes, white blood cells, macrophages, okay, to help take care of any kind of foreign antigens. And the red pulp takes care of those red blood cells that have come to die. Okay. All right. Okay, as far as tonsils go, we went over the 4 that we have already, so we know where they're located. And basically, they're just collections of malt. They're just mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. They're hanging out in the nasopharynx and the oropharynx, waiting to mount an immune response as necessary. Okay. All right, so that's tonsils. And that's lymphatic system, so that's nice. Short and sweet, not too much detail.